As part of Zonta's International 16 Days of Activism, which is an annual event, we're hosting a panel discussion, about human trafficking. And oftentimes we think that trafficking is something that happens somewhere else, in some back corner of the world, not in this world, and not on our island. So it is happening right here in our own backyard, and tonight we plan on a lively discussion about that. Some of the questions that we want to address: how do we know it's happening? How do we recognize it? How do we help? These kinds of questions are what we will seek to answer. We have expert panelists, each bringing their own perspectives on the issue as it stands in Hawaii. I'm starting out our evening tonight will be Susanna Tiapulu. She's going to speak for a brief time, and then we're going to, I'll introduce the rest of the panelists and our distinguished panelists as well. Susanna.
Aloha. I am from the South Pacific, American Samoa, born and raised. I'm going to start out tonight sharing with you something that happened when I was 7 years old. My father was a fisherman. My mother was a teacher. My dad used to go out spearfishing at night. When I was about 9 or 10, I went out with him. We'll talk about child labor in a few minutes. But when I was 7, I woke up one morning, and my father had gone out, he had come home, and he had brought home a man. He had been out in the village next to ours, and he found a Korean man hiding in the cliffs. My father did not speak Korean. This man spoke neither Samoan nor English. And yet my father had somehow communicated with this man. And my father and mother, I heard them talking. They were worried. And you know, you remember as a child, listening to your parents when they're talking in that worried tone of voice, and they're whispering and they're talking. My father believed that this man would be killed if they returned him to the fishing boat. He had jumped overboard in the middle of the night and swum to shore and had been hiding. He was able to share with my father that someone else on the boat had been killed, and he believed he would be next. This would have been in the 60s. He was hidden up in our plantation, up at one of the plantation workhouses, and he was there. My father took him food every morning and every night, and then after several weeks he was just gone. I remember my parents were waiting until the boat left so that they could take him into town. My father has died, my mother has died. I cannot ask them how they knew. I cannot ask them why they believed him, but I believe that that man was trafficked long before we had the language of trafficking. My village was remote in American Samoa. We did not get a road until the year that I left for college. So a tiny, remote village of 300 people, and as a child, I remember this fisherman being hidden in the plantation. So it's not that we don't have trafficking, it's that we don't have the language. We sometimes aren't able to communicate, and we aren't able to identify what we're seeing as trafficking. I would like to acknowledge and thank our organizers for ensuring that here in Hawaii, that will not continue. And I really honor each of you for being here tonight. You gave us your evening. Many of you have long days, many things on your plate, and you are here to try to identify what you can do. So I know our distinguished panel, this is an exciting moment for us because we get all of you. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about human trafficking. I'll speak for about 10 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to the panel. If you have a question, feel free to ask. This is the beginning of a discussion. Okay? This isn't a comprehensive overview of human trafficking in 10 minutes. Let's go! It is not that. There is a team. I'm a prosecutor here at the local office. I have been working in the field of justice responses, social justice, and human rights for more than 20 years. I was a prosecutor in Honolulu back in the 90s. I was a prosecutor, served as an assistant attorney general in American Samoa during the investigation of Daiwusa, the Daiwusa factory. It is still the largest human trafficking case ever prosecuted successfully in the United States. 6 miles from my home, we had men and women, mostly women, about 240, that did not speak English who were being trafficked in a textile factory. They were being systematically starved, had not been paid. This would have been in the 1999. The Trafficking Victim Protection Act, which was the first federal statute created to address trafficking, was passed in 2000. Diwusa was one of the first cases prosecuted. When the Department of Labor stepped in to weigh the people who worked in the factory, I had full-grown adults that weighed 70 pounds. We did not understand what was happening to the people in the factory. As a prosecutor, I will be honest, until trafficking, I tended to look at children. My area of focus has always been familial violence, sexual abuse, child abuse. I look at every child for dehydration. I look at their hair, I look at the skin under their eyes. It is part of my work. Until the Diwusa investigation, I never brought those eyes to adults. I now look at all adults with the same eyes that I look at children. We have a human trafficking law, and I'm going to hold these up. I brought a document that has sort of a description of human trafficking, both sex and labor, and some really great definitions on the back. There is a team in my office here at I'm a deputy prosecuting attorney, and under Mitch Roth's leadership, we are really committed to identifying the marginalized populations who tend to be trafficked. In many communities, those would be individuals that get prosecuted. Those would be the individuals that get prosecuted. We are really committed to making sure that we have the right people on trial and that we look at everyone in our community for potential exploitation and abuse, and that we are able to hear and communicate and understand what they've experienced in a trauma-informed way. We have a team within our office that's interested in speaking with each of you. So, for the very detailed overview of human trafficking, what the laws are, how they apply, who they apply to, how to understand them, that framework, please reach out to us. My business cards are at the back, and there's a group of us who would like to work with you. So if you have students, if you have faith communities, if you have an organization, or if you just want to give us a call and have a cup of coffee, we would love to meet with you and talk to you about human trafficking in Hawaii. It is only with your help that we will be able to identify victims of trafficking. And on that note, I'm going to talk quickly about sex and labor trafficking. The discussion of trafficking is difficult because of the language, partially because of what we're talking about, so the content is traumatic. If anyone is emotionally disturbed, please take a moment to take care of yourself. We take for granted as professionals in the field that we can talk about violence without further hurting others. We don't want to share that trauma, but we do want to help you understand what victims may be experiencing. So I'll try to be gentle with my language, but please take care of yourself as needed. Labor trafficking and sex trafficking are different, and I'll talk to you a little bit about those differences. The problem with, and I just talked about language, is that trafficking implies movement. Shakespeare invented 1,200 words. We should have a better word than trafficking, because a child does not have to move to be trafficked. So a child can remain in their own bedroom and be sold sexually in their own bedroom, never leaving their house, and it would constitute trafficking if someone profits from it. So there's a lot of confusion about the language about trafficking because our words aren't really accurate. Welcome, we just got started. Labor trafficking involves this forced use of labor. So an individual, and there are many different industries where you might see labor trafficking, but an individual whose services are obtained through force, fraud, or coercion, and they have very little autonomy. When we talk about how to identify a victim of trafficking, what we're looking at is control. So some of the things I start thinking about are, do they live in their place of work? If they live in their place of work, then boundaries can be confused. The factory that I described a few minutes ago, the individuals who worked in the factory, they slept in the factory. How many people here are investigators? How many investigators do I have in the room? I deputize all of you. When Lieutenant Melemai comes in tonight, she will be so happy because they are understaffed. So I have a question for you. As my new investigators, if you went to a factory and you saw that there was a gate around this job, this place of employment, and a guard shack at the front, what would you think? How many of you work behind, and if you work at the prison, you don't count. How many of you work where there is a gate and a guard shack? Okay, I'm going to make it just a little bit easier for you. How about 4 feet of concertina wire at the top of the gate, the wall that went around the factory? So the textile factory that we were investigating had walls around the building and 4 feet of concertina wire. The people within that factory were allowed out for a few hours every evening, and they were allowed out. Most of them just walked around asking for jobs and looking for food. So for many miles around the factory, everyone knew that in the evening, from about 5 until 9, people would knock on your door and say, work, 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 sewing, cleaning, because they weren't being paid and hadn't been paid in months. And they got thinner and thinner. Some of them would pick food up out of the mud. We look with great criticism at communities. You know, we think about the Balkans, Kosovo, Albania, and Serbia, and we look at the great brutality of communities towards each other. I will tell you that when the Daewoosa factory people were collecting food from the mud, there was a legislator who proposed a law that would make it illegal to pick up rotting food from the mud. I did not have victim services at the time. I didn't have people like Melody Strong in my community. What I did have, though, is I had faith partners. We had a lot of faith communities and churches. I didn't have enough food for 240 victims. I certainly didn't have 240 beds. We didn't have clothing. We didn't have anything for them. We partnered with our churches and our community leaders, and we were able to feed and house and clothe all of those individuals until we were able to get them off the island and into safety. We didn't move quickly enough. One woman lost an eye. We had people with significant injuries, and 2 of the leaders were lost at sea under suspicious circumstances. Remember, I deputized you all. What do you think about this? 2 women who don't swim went to one of the most dangerous cliffs on that particular island where no one ever swims, and they swam. Drowning, suspicious. I see a couple of people, your foreheads are knotted. That's a good sign. You would have investigated. But a lot of the questions around autonomy. Do you have access to your documents? And that's not the kind of question you can casually ask someone. Can you call home? Have you been able to call home? You know, for someone who is working here, who is from another country, do they have access to language? They don't have access to language, they're much easier to control. Remember all those textile workers? Most of them had paid as much as $20,000 to come here. Their families were in debt. Many of them were afraid that their families would be hurt. We believe that some of the family members were hurt when they were trying to speak out. And we were learning how to protect. So the questions we ask are not questions you typically ask. How many people here go to the store? I'm jealous of those who don't raise your hands. Who does your shopping? You and I need to talk. I've had bars and brothels where the women have to pay by the minute to leave. And that's in U.S. jurisdictions. I'm not talking, and I have worked in other countries, but I'm talking about U.S. jurisdictions exclusively right now, where they have to pay by the minute. So all of the women who work in that particular establishment would come up with a list of their toiletries. What do they need? Shampoo, underarm deodorant. What do they need? They make a list. One person leaves, rushes around as quickly as they can, buys everything they can buy, soap, toothpaste, runs back, and then they pay. Because you save a lot of money if one person does all the shopping. So it's a loss of control. I'm going to talk to you, and I have in the back there also a power and control wheel. If anyone here has done any work with or has exposure to sort of outreach around intimate partner violence, domestic violence, the same issues of power and control that I see in familial settings are what I look for institutionally. Can they make choices? Can they leave? Do they have autonomy? Can they say no? Do they get to control? What decisions can they make and how? Many individuals who are trafficked originally agree to a relationship. So in sex trafficking, we might have a young woman who agrees to a relationship with a young man. We recently had a case here where we had an older woman who was being trafficked by a woman 10 years younger than her. She did not want to be sexually sold, but she was doing it to please her partner, and she felt pressured and coerced into being sexually used for money. She is not yet persuaded that this is wrong, so she still has affections for what I would call right now her trafficker. But she's very clear she doesn't like doing what she's having to do for money. She doesn't want to be used sexually for money, but she has to. And to me, that's the dynamic of trafficking. For those who are in the relationship for longer, we tend to see high levels of violence, or I have seen very high levels of violence. I have a great deal of anger at the depictions we see in the modern media. Pretty women that romanticizes and creates a narrative that I have not seen. And one of the questions we really have to ask as a society is, are we going to have the discussion about commercial sex? Can sex be purchased as a commodity? If sex is a commodity, then my ability to protect individuals is limited. I've done a significant amount of work in the Netherlands and in Germany where it has been legalized. In Germany, they legalized prostitution more than 15 years ago, believing that it would remove the violence if this was legal. They created an entire array of benefits. You could register as a sex worker. Prostitution right now in Germany, as of a year ago, was a 17 billion euro industry, $17 billion in the country of Germany. They had 42 sex workers in the country. I believe now that number is up to 46. That's how few people took advantage of it. Most individuals who have a child do not look at that infant, that beautiful face, and say, oh my God, I hope she becomes a prostitute. Most 3-year-old girls don't, when they're thinking about Halloween, say, my God, I hope I have to have sex 22 times this weekend in order to pay the rent. That's just not the dream that most of us have. So when we have industries that are predicated on commercial sex, it tends to be individuals without control who we see in those jobs. And yet there is the belief that this is a choice. So I'm glad you're here for the discussion, because it is something we have to discuss. We can't jump right into trafficking. We first have to discuss, do we believe in this? And for anyone who uses the phrase, the oldest profession, I'd point to Cain and Abel, and I still prosecute homicide. I have many homicide cases on my desk right now. Doesn't matter that it happened a very long time ago, if that happens to be your belief. I'm going to turn it over to our incredible panelists. I've talked a little bit about trafficking. If you have the time and energy, would like to do a little more, we have ways for you to do that, and I can't wait to turn it over. I'm going to share with you something that we think is really important. We tend to look at marginalized populations in criminal justice. I try to look at who's in my jurisdiction, who's moving through my jurisdiction, who has no access to systems of protection, because it's the populations that lack access to systems of protection, education, health, justice, who we tend to see as victims. It's also if I have problems within the justice system, who we look at for culpability. So when we're trying to hold our justice system accountable, my test is how do we treat those in the community who lack access to systems of protection, my marginalized peoples. So I'm going to talk to you about one of those women that I worked with in the 1990s. And this is not her name. Jerry made choices no child should make. As a teenager in Hawaii, she was sexually exploited on the streets and in the suburban neighborhoods that many of you, not unlike the neighborhoods that many of you probably live in today. She was sold for sex to men. The individuals in the community who knew how she was being used despised her for it. She was judged. And I am not going to describe the sexual acts that she was forced to perform or endure. I am not going to discuss the sexually transmitted diseases that she acquired as a result of her exploitation or the consequences of that exploitation to her health as an adult now. I am not going to discuss the physical abuse she experienced at the hands of men who sexually assaulted her or the degradation of her spirit. I am, though, going to talk to you about her childhood. Jerry was the oldest child of 7. She came from a remote rural community far from Hawaii. Her father was a successful local businessman. He was an elder at his church. Her mother was a nurse, and she worked the night shift. Jerry was sexually assaulted by her father as early as she could remember. The language that we use in the field, the phrase that we hear is that incest is boot camp for prostitution and sex trafficking. When Jerry brought friends to her home for sleepovers, her father sexually exploited them. In one of these occasions, the child she brought over screamed, woke all the other children up. The next morning, when the mom came home from the hospital, the mother blamed the child who had screamed and said she wore revealing pajamas. Apparently purple pajamas on a 7-year-old are enough to trigger rape. Jerry learned young who was responsible for rape. As an adolescent, Jerry was frequently out on the fishing boats being used by entire crews that had been at sea for 6 and 9 months. She is what we would now call an index child, frequently taking other children with her. We can't talk to the dynamics of that. We don't know whether she was lonely and wanted an ally, whether she thought this was cool and grown up, wanted to take someone with her, or whether having others with her meant she had to experience less. She became pregnant at 14 after being left at a construction site for a month. She was apparently, from our records, a fairly good mother for the few weeks before they took that child from her. Her beverage of choice was vodka. She used to cut the vodka with soy sauce. She believed, and she described to us, that if you drank a lot of soy sauce, the salt content would give you a fever, and if you had a fever, maybe you didn't have to do as much with Dad. She described the physical and sexual abuse by her father. She also described to us the point in her life when she would initiate the sex with her father. She talked about her father. Remember, I said she was the oldest of 7. And she mentioned that he would often look at her sisters. She called them her babies. And she knew that look. When she saw him look at her sisters, she would stand up, sit on his lap, and make sure that he did not go near them. As a child, Jerry made choices that we cannot imagine. We cannot fathom. Is it any wonder that when she became an older teen and a young woman, she made choices that we as a society struggle to understand? We welcome you as partners in trying to reframe this discussion and our understanding of the individuals and the victims that we see in sex and labor trafficking. Thank you. My business card is at the back, and I look forward to working with each of you.
We'll continue with the rest of our panel. I'm going to take a moment to introduce them because we were trying to get a little bit back on schedule a little earlier. I didn't do intros. My name is Kathleen McGilvray. I have at the panel Melody Stone. She's a founder of the Hawaii Island Coalition Against Human Trafficking, which meets in Kona and Hilo. Formerly, she was a trauma-informed clinical therapist for 20 years in Iowa, and since moving here in 2014, she's used her clinical expertise and trauma experience to continue with a teletherapy practice and also to conduct education and advocacy in human trafficking, intervention, homelessness, and working with hard-to-serve populations. Renee Parrington is a mom who found it impossible to sit back and do nothing while children are being exploited. She believes it takes a community effort to coordinate and maintain lasting cultural shifts. She serves for Ho'ola Naupua as their regional coordinator and educational advocate to bring awareness of the commercial sexual exploitation of children to Hawaii Island. And Zaheva Z. Zaidoff is a behavioral health therapist working with addiction, mental health, and trauma for over 10 years. She's a certified substance abuse counselor and a certified prevention specialist. She has worked in inpatient, outpatient, shelters, and hospitals without walls, and she joins us from West Hawaii. I'm very pleased to have all of our panelists here. Some of your perspectives on this modern day slavery, forced labor, sex trafficking, domestic servitude, because that's what we're talking about tonight, exploitation through force, fraud, or coercion. How do you see the problem of human trafficking and modern day slavery? Everything, it could be anything from sex trafficking, domestic help, manufacturing, agriculture, and sweatshops, as Susanna talked about it. This is on, and I think you've got another one right there. Would you mind starting us out, Melody?
It's an honor to be here tonight. And I love that Susanna deputized everybody here because we all need to have our eyes open to this issue. It is happening on our island, and when I first came here in 2014, I talked with a lot of people, and they said, no, it's not happening here, not on this island. Might be happening in Honolulu or other places, but I knew that it was, and I started just keeping my eyes open and watching for things. So now I'm really aware of labor trafficking going on throughout our island, and also sex trafficking with minors as well as adults. And I have crossed paths with some of these victims. And fortunately, I've had the opportunity to help a few of them to get to safe places. In both of those cases, it was to leave the island because they weren't safe here. They were, their pimps were, they wouldn't have been safe staying here. So we were able to make a plan, and one woman went back to her country of origin, and the other one went back to the mainland where she was from. And these were both young women, not minors. So in my clinical experience in Iowa, I did work with some trafficked victims, and they were all minors. But I also worked with women that had been through domestic violence and sexual abuse and incest, as Susanna mentioned. So these things kind of all connect together. So when I came here, I had a heart and a passion like all of us here, have a passion for this work, to do something to make a difference. And so I felt that it would be good to start the Hawaii Island Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And so we just started in a little grassroots group, and eventually I talked with the prosecuting attorney assistant, Dale Ross, and I said, can we join forces with you and kind of become a team? Now, I want to clarify, we don't work underneath the prosecutor's office. We're not directly connected with them, but they do allow us to use their offices, and that way we can connect both sides of the island. So if any of you here are interested in working more and getting more involved with human trafficking prevention, please talk with me afterwards. I'd love to share with you more. And as we've started this coalition, we have modeled this after what King County is doing in Seattle. Washington State is on the leading edge of human trafficking prevention. And so sometimes, you know, rather than reinvent the wheel, you look at what's working with other states and other places around the world and you go, why reinvent the wheel? Let's look at what they're doing and in some ways implement those things here. So in our coalition, we are working in 8 different sectors. And those sectors include healthcare, education, and I work with Renee with Ho'olanapua, and we are education advocates as well. And so we are able to go into the schools on our island and do some education in our schools. So that's really a wonderful thing to work directly with the students. So it's healthcare, education, the faith-based sector. We have business and the employers, the legal sector. We have the at-risk sector, and technology and media. So those are our 8 different sectors. If you have interest in any one of those areas, we still have gaps, and we need to fill those gaps with people that have some interest and expertise that can help us move forward with education and prevention. And one of the things that I'm really been excited about is moving into our 2018 legislative session. I was able to get our legal team, our legal sector together, and we, with the legal sector, I presented to them what Shared Hope International has recommended for the state of Hawaii for some CSEC laws to be changed. And CSEC is children that are exploited through commercially for sex trafficking. And we worked really hard for over a week, and we have moved forward with changing 13 statutes in the state of Hawaii. And I'm so excited about this. So, you know, we need to continue to talk with our legislators and say, you know, we've got to change our laws here. And we did get a law in July of 2016 for sex trafficking in the state of Hawaii. We were the last state to implement that. And it's a pretty solid law, but we have some gaps and some holes that need improvement. So we're moving forward with trying to make 13 changes, and our legal team got together for that. So I'm really, really pleased about that. And one thing I love about this island is that we work as a grassroots community here. I don't know so much about Hilo, but I know in Kona I work with a lot of organizations and people, and we don't always have a lot of resources, but what we do have, we try to pool things together, utilize our resources, and work as a team, and we have to do that. With human trafficking, it's such a huge problem. It's the fastest growing problem in the world right now, fastest growing crime. And we have a lot of runaways and children that are missing or unaccounted for, anywhere between 100 and 300 kids every month in the state of Hawaii. And there's a statistic, within about 48 hours, of those kids running away or being unaccounted for, 1/3 of those kids will be approached by a trafficker. That's shocking when you think about it. That's really shocking. So as a community, there's something that everyone in this room can do to make a difference. Sometimes people in churches will pray. Other people will say, I'm a nurse, I can get out there and I can do some training, and I have some excellent training materials for healthcare providers. I go out and do some healthcare and mental health training for healthcare professionals. So, whatever area you have that's an interest, please feel free to jump on board because we need people. Something else that, and then I'm going to hand the mic over to Renee here. Something else that we have just started, and I'm really excited about this. This is a new program called Hawaii Island Safenet, and it is a faith-based group of people that are coming together in churches across our island to provide. We are working to open safe houses for victims, not just women, but also men as well, and people coming out of labor trafficking situations as well as sex trafficking. And there's going to be some training on that coming up very soon. And this will be a network of people that have expertise in various areas. It might be in the legal area, it could be in counseling, it could be in education, but a variety of different skills. Sometimes it might just mean taking a victim to a doctor's appointment or to the pregnancy center to get an ultrasound or something like that. Because remember, victims don't have cars, they don't have money, and so they have to rely on people that will come alongside of them and be a support to them. So that's what Hawaii Island's Safenet is going to be all about, and I'm really excited about starting this program and teaming with some people on our island. So if you're interested in that as well, that's a faith-based program. So we'll be getting together with a lot of churches here to do some work in that area. Because we just don't have the monies to start all kinds of programs and things like that. But if you can get people that have expertise and can get some training, then there's a lot we can do to make a difference here on our island. So I'll pass the mic over to Renee here.
Thank you so much. Okay, Kathleen said that there are experts. I'm not an expert at all. I'm not a counselor like Melody or a prosecutor like Susanna. I'm a mom with 4 girls who about 7 years ago met a woman who lived in a suburb on the mainland, lovely suburb, who was trapped in that house for 2 years. And her story just broke me. And after she got done speaking, I went up to her and I said, oh my gosh, like what can I do? I'm a homeschool mom, I'm a caterer, and I don't know what to do. But I know that if I lived in the 1700s, I would want to be an abolitionist because I don't think anybody should be enslaved. And she looked at me and she said, wherever you go, tell people that this is real, because people don't believe it is real. And I said, okay, I know about event planning and I can cater events. So some friends of mine, just other moms, no experience, put on events and started telling people this was happening. So when I moved to Hawaii, I went to an event at the University of the Nations, and this group, Ho'olanapua, was there, and they presented, and they're building a 32-bed facility on the North Shore of Oahu, a therapeutic facility that girls 11 to 17 can go and find healing. And so I went up to them afterward, like, okay, I want to volunteer or whatever. And they said, okay, you'll be our regional coordinator. And I thought, me? Like, what am I going to do to be a regional coordinator? And they said, you just need to spread the word. So I put on these trainings for volunteers just like yourself to come learn about it. We do community events. We'll go wherever, whenever, bring a little pop-up tent and our information, and people will walk by and they'll say, oh, this isn't happening here. And so we start telling them the stories. And there's this idea that your eyes don't see what your mind doesn't know, and we can walk by like blindly forever and never see anything, but once you know it and you start seeing signs or hearing about things, then all of a sudden you start to see it all over the place. And it's sad. It just last two weeks ago, I was at the Makahiki Festival, in Kona. And I had a gentleman, like an old uncle, just tatted up tough guy, was like, this isn't happening here. And I talked to him for a little bit. And like a half hour later, he came back and was almost weeping in my arms because this had happened to him on this island as a child. And this happens all the time when we present. And people are triggered and they say, yes, absolutely, what can we do? And so all I know what to do is just go around and continue to spread the word. Because I figure that if enough people wake up and realize what is going on, then there are brilliant people. I'm sure there are brilliant people with all kinds of mad skills in this room that can contribute to doing something about it. So if we keep talking about it and having a conversation like this, then everybody can like become experts. So we do have a regional coordinator on this side of the island for Ho'olumpua, and she's in Pahoa. And if you want to get her information, then you can join with her. And we are education advocates. Melody is also trained up. We went through a training, and we're going into the schools here in 2018, maybe even in 2017. In church youth groups. And we have a curriculum, it's about 45 minutes long, and we're just trying to establish, do we go into, health classes or social studies classes, but just to let our kids know what to look for. If you see this young lady and all of a sudden she's dressing different and she has this older boyfriend and she has expensive clothing and her boyfriend doesn't have a job, instead of, the other girls maybe looking and calling her names that they shouldn't, like something's going on with her, like care enough to ask her what is going on. Teachers, counselors, everybody, if they're just trained up, then we can make a difference. So if you want us to come to your school, if you're involved in the school system or into the church youth groups or parent discussions, then we're just a bunch of volunteers ready to go in and talk about it. So that's it for me.
And just a reminder to everyone, before Z starts talking, we do have question or concern cards. If you're thinking about questions for our panelists, we'd love to include them. And some will be, if you hold it up, someone will come by, pick one up, and we'll bring them back up here too. Please, Z.
So hi, I'm Z. Bio was, pretty much who I am, except not at all. That's always how it works, right? We're supposed to present our best foot forward, how professional we are. Toss that out when you're putting a bio together. I was a victim as a kid. That's a part of my story. My stepfather was a photographer, and I found out later he was on parole when my mom met him and when they got married, and he put up cameras in the hallways of the house, and he had all the boas and the fancy stuff and the scarves and all the. He used to love to take pictures, and my friends would come over and take pictures of everyone, and pictures are better if you move the shirt out of the way, and what all that looks like. And I was 6, woke up one morning, and someone had been in my room that night. My story continued. He was all about the picture taking, and I didn't think much of it, right? Never told anybody, never thought anything of it, thought it was my fault, right? The typical story of the victim who you hear from. And then I got older, and then I started drinking. I'm a daily drinker from age 11. And then I got into drugs, went to high school, crime. Computers were just coming out at that point, internet, right? So found out that I was pretty decent at hacking back in the day, right? So figured out how to get money. Sold, credit cards and was able to do identity fraud and credit card fraud and made money and did too much meth and drank too much alcohol and became a brown belt in 3 types of martial arts because I was going to defend myself because it was never going to happen again. But I'd never told anybody what did happen, so it almost didn't matter. And then at 22, I decided I was done. I had lectured on college campus about God. I was raised Orthodox Jew. I knew God. I know Hebrew. That's my thing. I was always pretty smart. Been in Mensa since I'm 7. Right? IQ always off the charts. And it was like, okay. And I knew that I couldn't tell anybody the truth about anything ever. And so I took a 1/4 ounce of meth and 2 boxes of prescription sleeping pills and 2 pints of vodka after I found out that I had a brain tumor. And all of that was in a conscious attempt to end my life. And then I woke up, and I was like, I didn't have any contingency plans for what that looked like. And so I put on my pink Winnie the Pooh sweatshirt and a potato sack-like skirt that I had in my little duffel bag, and $137, and I put it in my sock, and I started to walk to the Greyhound station. Somebody I knew in my small little community asked me what was up, and I told them, I just tried to kill myself, and I can't do that right. I've been doing drugs, you have no idea, I'm really good at hiding it, and they were like, you should stay right there. And I got dropped off at rehab, where they said there were no beds, because pretty sure that's the line you're supposed to use, right? Anytime someone calls, you say there's no beds to find out if they're serious. I don't know exactly what that is, but they dropped me off in the lobby, and surprise, surprise, there was a bed. And I've been sober since that day, which is kind of huge, because most people don't. And I've devoted the rest of my life to figuring out where all of these issues intersect. That's what that looks like for me, right? I've been homeless, Skid Row, Tent City, LA, 45,000 homeless people in 8 blocks by 5 blocks, 42% vets, all right there, right? What all of that looks like. And so I've been there too, right? What all this looks like, and became a drug and alcohol counselor and started working in mental health. And I realized that depression doesn't mean you're lazy, and psychosis doesn't mean you're crazy, and anxiety doesn't mean you have so much energy, and ADD doesn't mean you're a jerk, right? Like, went through and really started figuring out what all this looks like, and really focusing on the intersection between homelessness and addiction and mental health and trauma and trafficking and not having choice and not being aware of what's going on, and what does it look like? And at one point it hit me that my story means nothing if I don't share it. So I share it. And I share it without tears, because you could offer me $1 million right now in this moment to change my past. And I absolutely would not take it, because the life that I have led brought me to where I am right now. And I can tell you that my husband and my daughter, who's 10, who's sitting at home and fighting right now about what vegetables to eat for dinner. So I'm, taking a look at the phone, trying to mediate between the husband and the tween, right, while everything's happening. And they've never seen me drink, and they've never seen me do drugs, and they've seen me miss bedtime and prayer time and gratitude that we do together as a family every night to drive out and do this. Youth suicide is a huge issue on our island. Huge. And again, as a survivor of someone who consciously tried to end their life, I can tell you that we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it, and it happens. And there's probably people in this room that have been affected by it. There were 2 in Honokaa in the last month and a half. Right, the year I moved here, there were 3 in Puna, within a week apart from each other. The end of last year, Ka'una'aleu, right, Naleu Pahala, all the names of the schools confuse me. Recent graduate there, Konawaina, a year and a half ago. Right, that's my area. I live in Captain Cook. It was a rape at the local high school 3 months ago. I got the phone call on a Saturday morning. I'm grateful that I got the phone call on a Saturday morning, because I got to wake up the psychiatrist from the Department of Education on a Saturday on the cell phone, because I had the cell phone number of the psychiatrist from the DOE, because when you get involved in your community and you talk, people will give you numbers, because they trust that you're not going to prank call them at 4 in the morning, right? So you get information. And then we talk about it, and then we talk about it. And we don't do that with suicide, because there is a school of thought in the behavioral health world that suicide is a contagion. And that is true. When somebody knows somebody who has died by suicide, the chances, the fact that their brain now sees it as an option, that is 100% true. You know what else is 100% true? That if we don't talk about it, nobody believes it's happening, and we can't offer help. Those to me are the hardest things. It is a trafficking issue, because addiction is a trafficking issue, because mental health is a trafficking issue, because all of this, because trauma is a trafficking issue, because our youth not having an adult in their life that they believe loves them is a trafficking issue. And people desperately wanting to join a hula halau, but not having the money to get there because their single parent works 3 jobs and they don't have transportation. You know what that is? It's a trafficking issue, because all of these issues intersect. And if we don't start talking about them, we're going to keep burying people.
So once again, if you have cards, please fill them out, and we'll have some of your discussion questions as well. I know that all of you have knowledge about sex trafficking. What about the area of domestic servitude or forced labor here on the island? Do you think it exists? And can you share a little bit about that? Because I think we do talk about, or at least I know I hear a lot more about sex trafficking for whatever reason, thinking of a child victim. But as Susanna said, adult victims are very real. It's happening, just as sexual exploitation is. But can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that? How is it different? Why is it we may or may not talk about it so much? And what some of your thoughts are about the reality of that happening right here on our island?
Labor and sex trafficking of adults, or domestic servitude and labor?
Domestic servitude and
Understood.
labor. I think that each of you talked about sex trafficking, but what does that look like?
Yep.
Is that happening here?
Absolutely. I can speak to what I know, to what I've seen, to what I've heard. I have a friend who owns one of, the smaller hotels here on the island, and when the new owner took over, which was her, she went in, and there were 4 housekeepers and 3 busboys who took off. They were gone completely, and she was asking what's going on and where did people go, and I met them, and they were so nice, and a family member was able to call and to bring them all back, and they were hysterical, asking her if she was going to beat them or send them back, and if she now had their passports and their paperwork, because they really just wanted to get home. And one of the family members came in as a translator to find out they took off. They were terrified. And this was about a year and a half ago, and it was the first I'd heard, and she called me because she knew me. And she's like, what do I do? How do we help? And I'm like, well, let's see if the passports are in the safe. And they were. The passports and the birth certificates and the ID from their home countries. And anybody that wanted to go home, her and her husband bought a plane ticket for them and helped them to go. And those who wanted to stay, she reached out to her church community and got each of the families adopted-ish by, the faith-based, and helped them to get into housing and to be taken care of. I can't speak much more to the labor and the domestic servitude, but I absolutely know that we live here. It doesn't happen maybe as much in some of the smaller areas here on Big Island, but anytime you have the big hotels and you have the big industries, it is much easier to pay somebody not minimum wage or not pay them at all to clean a hotel room than it is to pay somebody a living wage to be able to do it. And I now have firsthand information of at least, 7 to 10 people with kids, and there were grandparents, the whole family's here. So beyond that, I'm going to pass it on to someone who might know more than that than me.
And I know that.
Melody, it is.
I'm aware of, I was contacted by the Salvation Army in Honoka'a, and they were very concerned about a young man that was working on one of the farms, and he had been, he's about 21 years old, and he had been trafficked for 3 years, had never gotten a paycheck at all, never gotten one dime, and was just skin and bones. And they were working him 7 days a week, probably 14 hours a day. He was afraid to leave. His mom lived in the area, and she was very concerned, but he didn't really believe that he was being trafficked. And that's one of the major problems that we run into, is that people that are being trafficked don't see themselves as being trafficked or victims. Lots of times they think, well, I'm just trying to help this farmer out, growing their coffee or whatever, and I do have a place to live, and he does give me a sandwich every day and a can of pop and a little bit of food. And so they kind of justify it, and the person sometimes they're in some cases, romantic relationships with people. And so, people, through coercion and fraud, their minds start playing tricks on them, and they start thinking, this person really cares about me because they want me to stay here, and they, pat me on the back and say, good job, and I really need you here, and I couldn't do it without you. And so their sense of self-esteem and connection with that person grows in different ways, and sometimes it can be a romantic connection. But this young man is not ready to leave yet. And so I told the Salvation Army, I said, I'm willing to help if he is ever at a point where he's willing to leave. There's a team of us on the island that will go in, and I even have someone that's an ex-Marine that said, I'll go in and I'll get him, and he will be safe with me. And I said, I believe that. Anyway, so we do have a team of people that can go in and help people get out of these situations. But one of the biggest hurdles is that people are afraid to get out. They don't see any safe way out of the life that they're in. And sometimes they're being threatened, like maybe the trafficker will say, well, I'm gonna kill your family, or I'm gonna hurt them, or I'll go after them in some way. And so they're just petrified. They're so fearful. And so I've known of other situations around our island, and right now there's women that have come here from the Philippines and other places that are indentured servants, and they're also providing sex trafficking services as well. Sometimes it's labor and sex that's going on. And so I am aware all over our island, even in remote places where you would think, oh, well, it's probably not going on here. You have people, you're going to have trafficking situations going on. So we just try to get out and do what we can to inform and educate people, and asking, sometimes if you're in a community and you're asking your neighbor a question, like Susanna said, it's important to ask the proper questions to build a relationship with people, and sometimes after a while they'll begin to trust you. They'll let down their guard and they'll start disclosing things, and then sometimes you're able to get them connected and with someone that will help them.
I think it's interesting that when we were talking about in a smaller area, or in this little town, it doesn't happen. But we do have to be aware that this is an agricultural community. This is an island where you can live in isolation for a long time. We might not know our neighbors like we used to. And so we've had cases of agricultural workers as well as manufacturing that have been on our island. We have woofers that come. They don't know what kind of situation they're going to get into, as well as I know several people who have been to foreign countries and come back with a spouse who may be a spouse in name only, may or may not have access to their documents, and that's a pretty common occurrence here on island. So I think definitely there are a lot of situations that we might want to be thinking about with a more informed lens.
With regards to, I shared with you about our changing our CSEC laws and working on protecting our children, our youth. And we have 13 statutes that are going forward in the legislature now. But I'm also meeting next Monday with an attorney and looking into what we can do in our labor trafficking area, because that's something that our coalition wants to pay attention to as well. About 60% of the trafficking that's going on is labor trafficking. People think, it would be 80 or 90% sex trafficking, but really the reality is probably we're sitting here in this room, most of the clothing we're wearing right now was probably made in a sweatshop somewhere. And that really makes me sick to think about that. So there's a lot of it going on farms and in various kinds of labor situations. And so that's one thing our coalition is really going to be pressing into. Because on our island and in Hawaii, fishing, illegal fishing is going on. We have a lot of people just off of our coasts that are being trafficked and they're enslaved in our fishing industry. And that's one huge issue that we have here, as well as other things as well.
What are the specific signs to look for to find out if someone might be being trafficked? As we do meet our neighbors, if we're reaching out and we're just being part of our community, what can we notice, and what should we be noticing? Susanna talked about malnourishment, bags under the eyes, or signs of dehydration, malnutrition. What are some other things that you would typically want to be on the lookout for, or would be warning signs and something that you might want to probe further or maybe make someone aware of?
Well, dealing specifically with kids, I would look at things like truancy. I mean, I know that a lot of kids ditch school, but oftentimes the kids will even go to school on the bus, and then the trafficker would come and pick them up, and they're back on the bus at the end of the day. So trying to coordinate and educate bus drivers as well as teachers as well as parents. So truancies, like I said before, like expensive clothing, just change in demeanor, change in how they speak, maybe pulling away from certain groups of friends, bruises, cuts, burns, that kind of thing that maybe aren't affecting their face, but maybe on their body. Tattoos, oftentimes the pimps will brand the children with different tattoos, money signs, barcodes, whatnot, kind of in a hidden area. I just heard a physician talking about they had a girl come in and she needed a surgery, and it was a simple surgery that if you were being watched out for would have happened a lot sooner. So things like delayed attention to illnesses and whatnot. And when they performed the surgery, they saw dollar signs like on the inside of her thighs tattooed in, and they kind of looked at each other at the operating table like, whoa, but didn't do anything. And then a couple months later, she went to a training on trafficking and signs to look for, and everybody at that table thought, oh my gosh, this girl was on our operating table, but they didn't do anything, and they lost her because of it. So there's some.
I think some of the other things to look at, in addition to all those, which are fantastic, right? Because your question was, what are we looking out for, but when do we probe further? What are the types of questions we ask? In what that looks like. It also, you're looking at, I mean, any change in behavior, of course, but you're also looking for drug use. You're also looking for non-developmentally appropriate things that are going on in their lives, right? So, for example, a 6 to 8 year old, when you give them the option, do you want mac and cheese or quesadilla for dinner? And they say mac and cheese. And then a week later, you ask them the same question. Do you want mac and cheese or quesadilla for dinner? And they say quesadilla. And then a week later, when you ask them and they say, I have no idea. Okay, well, what do you want? I don't know. Absolutely developmentally appropriate, right? Everyone in the room that's a parent or has ever been around a kid knows that moment comes. But then you hit a point where the flexibility starts to come and where the brains actually will start changing from concrete thinking alone to abstract thinking, where they have the ability to be logical, deductive reasoning is present, right? Like the fancy imaginative thoughts that were there when they were really young aren't there as much when they're 14 and 15. They become aware of the consequences of the actions. But here's the thing, the therapist in me wants to out loud to everybody here that trauma affects the appropriate developmental responses that go on. So if you want to know if something's been happening in someone's home and you're talking to a 14-year-old who absolutely believes that they could jump off the end of the world and be 100% fine by themselves with no one there at night because Superman's going to come in the cape and it's going to be fantastic, which might be a dream of a 6-year-old. when that's coming out of the 14-year-old's mouth, that's where you're asking more questions. It doesn't mean that 14-year-old is being trafficked, but it means there should be an adult in the life of that 14-year-old that is asking them a question. What's going on? Can you tell me more about that? Like, when did you last have that, the dream, the thought, the imagination? How do you feel at home? What are you doing? Are there events you'd love to be doing that you're not? Like, the things to look out for. One of the big ones I just want to toss out loud that I feel like everyone in this room can have a hand in the life of every youth you know, whether it be a youth you see at the supermarket, or if you're a teacher or a parent, you don't have to be in the profession. Everyone in the room is familiar with youth. One of the big things to realize is that if our youth have activities in their lives that they are passionate about and things that have meaning for them, they are less likely to be involved in it. It's not 100%, right? There are plenty of kids who've gone to church and been to hula and had their whole communities that are absolutely get trafficked as well. But the likelihood is less when there is a community around them. And so when there are youth that are coming in, or adults, by the way, like the whole concept of ohana and community applies just as much to every adult you'll ever meet as it does to all the youth in your world. But when you're looking at someone, people ask me, how do I help with that? Well, you could find a youth in your life that looks like they're having a rough time and ask them, if money was no object, what do you want to be doing? Oh, I want to do paddle club at Kayapua because they win all the time, right? I want to be part of that one. I don't want to be here, right? That's what I want to be doing. Okay, how come you're not doing it? Well, you don't live on that side of the island, but there's a paddle club right here. Well, it's a little expensive, and my mom, my dad, my auntie, my grandma, they can't get me there. What do you do after school? I'm home, I dream about paddling. Well, I'll bet there's somebody in that community with an extra seat in their car that could help the kid get to paddle practice 3 times a week. And that absolutely could help to save them and give them an ohana around them from a lot of the stuff. At least just more humans in their life that care about them and ask them how they're doing and can notice all of the things that Renee was just talking about. Because for a lot of our youth and adults, they just don't actually have the humans in their life to notice it. You could have every tool in the world of knowing exactly what to look for. And there are still a ton of people around that don't have anybody that are asking them. So just other things to keep in mind.
I was just going to say that I didn't mention, monitoring kids' devices is such a huge thing. 75% of 4-year-olds are handed a cell phone at some point. But statistics are showing that 80% of 8-year-olds have already viewed porn. It's so easy on the devices. So to monitor that so you can see what you're looking for. In 1991, I think there were 93 porn magazines in the United States, okay? Today, there are 231 billion places on the internet that you can view porn. And so we wonder why this is like a growing plague, because now an 8-year-old has seen people have sex on their mom's phone. By the time they're 15, they want to do this with the girl in school, and it just gets more deviant and deviant. Just like with drug use, it has to get more hardcore and more hardcore. That is the same thing, because the dopamines that are released in your brain by viewing pornography is going to make you desire more and more. So it doesn't matter if you're nosy. Check your kids' devices, know their passcodes.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And we have some material on that. I have written some material that I give to parents when I go out and speak with parent groups about what to watch for on the internet, different sites where kids are targeted, because it's not just the porn sites, but that was a really good point. There's traffickers out there trolling all the time, looking to target our youth. And kids, they're vulnerable, and we all know that on the social websites, you don't have, most of the kids don't know personally many of the people that they're connecting with. And it's so incredibly dangerous. And they think that they see a picture of someone, oh, this is a hot 15-year-old boy, he's so cute, And the likelihood of that really being the case is oftentimes not likely. So just some other signs, just a few others to watch for is if you notice a change in behavior, like if your child or youth was really involved in school, in sports and things like that, they're really tired a lot, they start to drop out of interests and move away from friendships that they had previously had. Typically, girls will seek out an older boyfriend, and this older boyfriend is grooming them. And sometimes that grooming process can go on for months. And so we've seen in the high schools here, and I've been aware of it with several girls recently that have been trafficked out of one of our high schools. And there was an older boyfriend situation, and he was grooming these two girls for a period of time. And the girls stopped going to soccer. They didn't want to go to soccer anymore, but they lied about it and said they were still going to soccer practice. So their parents thought that they were still involved with all those things. So there's ways that they have of, you know, kind of getting more isolated. And once they've become isolated, then it's much easier for them to be trafficked.
Melody, can you speak to adult non-sex assault trafficked folks? So people who are working in agriculture, what are some of the signs that we would be looking for with an adult person who is being exploited in an agricultural situation or a situation like that we might encounter here on the island? What are some of the warning signs there?
Well, sometimes, as Susanna pointed out, these people have very limited time to be out. They're working 14 hours a day, so if they do get to come into town, I've spoken with people from Salvation Army and other places, and they've said that they've noticed that some of these workers will come in, they might only have an hour, and their traffickers waiting outside for them, and they're keeping a close eye. So lots of times they're anxious, they're looking around, they're fearful, they go into a store, maybe they have very little money, sometimes they don't have money hardly at all, and go in and ask at the Salvation Army thrift store, can we have this item or that item? Lots of times their clothing is tattered and dirty, and they're just very malnourished and look very unhealthy. So there's lots of signs, you know, it's important to people that are out there, you know, working in the store. Sometimes they start to develop a relationship, because if every Wednesday you have this group of girls coming in and they only have a half an hour, and they're in the stores in town and they're trying to get around and make the rounds to get what they need, then sometimes the shop owners can start to make connections with them and start to, you know, build a trust and a rapport. And then sometimes they'll start to disclose some things over a period of time. But those are some of the things.
And if there's somebody is answering for them, or they don't seem to have a voice or
Right.
or an ability to speak for themselves, and there's always someone with them or supervising them
Yeah.
or answering,
That's very common, yeah.
The one thing I've noticed with adults who are trafficked, labor or sex trafficking, but almost exclusively with adults, is anytime you ask to make a plan, they never can. Hey, next Tuesday at 4 o'clock, there's this event. I know you love the singer, and he's coming, and it's free, and it's in the park. Can I pick you up? Can you be there? It's always an I'm not sure. And that's something for me, because occasionally you'll find, you ask me, and it's like, give me a sec, let me check Google Calendar, right? But with some people, they don't have, that's the other one for adults, no device on them and never able to commit to a plan are two of the big ones for trafficking in the adult world.
somebody asked me to define woofer. I don't know what it actually stands for, but it's a work trade agreement, so a lot of, thank you. And they work on an organic farm most of the time, and you can come over to Hawaii and have a place to stay, and you get to exchange for your labor, and it can be a great way to live here for some folks, and it can also be an opportunity for someone to exploit someone to come in that you don't know know which way that is. So that's what I was referring to. The
World
might-
Organization of Organic Farmers.
Perfect. So, we only have a few minutes, and we have a couple of important questions. Someone was asking about who do they call. There is a reporting line. They've updated the mandatory reporting phone numbers for child abuse and neglect and suspected human trafficking. I have those up here for child abuse and neglect here. 1-888-380-3088. And for trafficking, the toll-free number is 1-888-988-6638. Those are two numbers that you might want to jot down if you would like to report. Those are actually for mandated reporters, but I think anyone who wanted to make a report, you can also contact the police department as well. I know that sex assault and child molestation and abuse happens. The YWCA, we have a free island-wide sex assault program. And just to give you some context, reporting, which is only about 40% of victims will report, we have more than one case every week. So we have about 60 cases a year on island. Of those, about 50% are children, and of those children, about 50% of those are under the age of 10. So it certainly does happen. It happens right here on our island. So I appreciate that everyone's talking about that. We're making sure that we're acknowledging that sex assault does happen and sexual molestation. But I also want to concentrate on the fact that we're talking about the broadest issue of trafficking and the possibility of agricultural trafficking and labor exploitation and other things a lot. As we're closing, can you talk about some thoughts on two of our questions from the audience? Pick up places for recruiting victims. How do people? How is that happening? And profilers, or a profile of what does a trafficker look like?
There's majority is women, but there are more and more women traffickers that they're finding. It doesn't matter the ethnicity, the age, it doesn't matter. It could be a girl in school, okay? Because I think Susanna was talking about it earlier.
Not the victims, though, of the traffickers, I think.
I'm
is what they
talking
were
about
thinking.
the traffickers.
Okay, so
I'm talking about
okay.
traffickers who can be a 16-year-old girl in the school because it would make it easier on their life if someone else took some of the burden off of them. And as far as the recruiting, I noticed on the poster that you have, and I've made posters like that as well with the tape and with the chains, and that grabs us emotionally, but more and more that is not the case, that you're just abducted and chained up. It's more often somebody that you know, somebody that you feel like you really love, that is the one that is going to bring you into a trafficking situation. So yeah, could look like anybody, anywhere.
So we've had girls approached at Starbucks, at Jamba Juice. I was here in Hilo at Panda Express about 6 months ago. I saw a trafficking situation come down right in front of my eyes. I was able to get a license plate number. If that young girl would have gone into the restroom, I was going to discreetly go in and give her what's called a shoe card. The Department of Homeland Security has these little plastic shoe cards, and I keep them in my purse, and they're very discreet. And so if you can safely slip something to a victim where there's some 800 numbers for them to contact if they want to get some help. But you need to be very careful about that, because if you're not very discreet about it, like if she would have gone into the restroom, I would have tried to just discreetly go in. But otherwise, they can be beaten, you know, if they make eye contact with you, and if their trafficker thinks they're being too obvious, they will be punished for it, and it can be extreme. So you really want to be, do no harm. You know, that's the whole focus here. Do no harm and be very careful. You never want to insert yourself into a situation. unless you're, you know, highly trained and you know what you're doing, or if you can discreetly, you know, slip something to someone. Like, no, airline stewardesses, I have a friend who's a stewardess, and she just saw something, and she was able to leave something with a victim and safely do that. And then when the plane landed, the person that this young girl was with was promptly detained, which was good.
The situations, in addition to everything everyone else has said, it's a 12-year-old at the bus stop, right, who's sitting down with a sketch pad and they're drawing. And then there's the 24-year-old male who comes to the bus stop who says he has no interest in her from a sexual place, right? He's there, he says, hi, we're in Hawaii, it's a hi back. And then, hey, are you drawing? Can I take a look at what you're drawing? And then she's like, no, I don't know you. But then it's 4 days later, they're both at the bus stop again. And he's familiar now. And so now she holds it up. And it's not the question of like, can I have your phone number? Do you want to date? It's never that. It's like, oh, that's totally awesome. And then they see each other 3 or 4 more times and 8 more times. And then he's looking at her artwork. And then there's a creepy guy at the bus stop, and he's stepping in, telling the creepy guy to back up from the 12-year-old and telling the 12-year-old, you got to be careful about people like that, right? Like, I feel like your older brother, like, don't even trip there. And then it's 2 months later, now they're running into each other at the supermarket. And now she feels like she has built a friendship with him. So then when he mentions he has a friend that has an art gallery, you know, in Los Angeles, and he asks if he can take some pictures of her artwork, and then whether he sends it or not, and then he lies to her and is like, oh, they were so interested. Maybe in a year or so when you're older, you'll take a trip. I bought tickets for you and Mom. Let's go together. And then she goes home to ask Mom, and Mom's like, are you out of your mind? Who is this guy you're talking to? Instead of inviting him into the house, Mom's pushing her closer into his arms. And now 8 months later, he's on the plane with her talking about, I can't believe Mom doesn't understand you. And now she's in a brothel in LA. And all of that happens at a bus stop in Puna, right, or in Captain Cook. So what does it look like? It looks like absolutely anything.
And anywhere there's people, arcades, bowling alleys, schools, churches, I mean, you know, trafficking goes on in all these places. So even in a school situation, or a park, or the library, you know, just wherever there's people, someone will come up and just approach, you know, in a casual way and start being friendly, and then they start making connections again. So,
Would any of you like to comment on some of the strengths of the statutes which might eliminate the continuing plea bargains taking place in our justice system, or talking about just maybe in general what our laws are and how they are helping, and very briefly, because we are almost out of time.
so there's 41 statutes in the state of Hawaii, 47 pages, you can look them up online, of sex trafficking laws, and specifically pertaining to CSEC. And we're working, there were 17 changes that Shared Hope International recommended that Hawaii make in terms of changes, and every year we have a national report card. Right now, Hawaii has a C on the national report card. When I first got here, we had an F, so we have nowhere to go but up, right? And my goal is to have at least a B by this time next year, as we're moving into the legislative process to get the laws changed. But some of the ones that we're focused on right now is having victims be really treated like victims, because there are still young girls that are being arrested and they're not being treated as victims in the state of Hawaii. I just spoke with Susanna last week about a case, and that should not be. There's no 12-year-old that is a prostitute. Okay, and so they can't be treated as criminals and prosecuted in that way. So that's one of the a major one that we're working to get changed, and then just to have appropriate support services for victims. And right off the top of my head, I should have brought all those statutes because I could have gone through some of them. But if you're interested in knowing more about that, I have all the statutes and what the recommendations are, and I can certainly send those to you.
Someone had asked about a legislative alert list or other things that we could do in maybe 15 or 20 minutes a week from home. If you have that kind of desire to help, I know that we can, our panelists can help us hook up with how we can help and where we can go to assist in these efforts to stop the exploitation of adults and children. And
Testimony is incredibly helpful.
online testimony.
The online testimony, right, on the bills that come out, people think you have to be there in person to testify, and this is in reality for any issue. But if you submit the online testimony, it becomes a part of the written record. So we always ask people specifically to write it, not just to go in person, because when it's part of the record, and as soon as it comes out, I have the email address. I mean, I'm on all the lists for all the legislators and all the specific issues. And so as soon as I get something that involves this issue at all, I can email it to Barbara, to Tanya, and we can get it out to all of us, right? Like, we can send it out. Like, need testimony now. You go on, it's 5 minutes. It's not 15. It's not 20. It's typing, please pass this. Our community deserves it.
So you're monitoring the lists. Is that coordinating, or are each of you with your with your respective organizations doing that kind of a legislative alert e-blast?
I don't have like a specific organization,
Okay.
right? I
I
kind
don't
of
know
work
if
for
you-
myself,
yeah.
but I'm super involved in that process. I'm connected with some people at the state legislature who look out for disabilities, who look out for youth. They have it all divided up by issue, and they'll list every bill, where it all is, what it all looks like. I can even send you the link so you can get it out to everybody. So.
With regards to these 13 statutes that we're trying to move forward, they're being grouped together. So I can alert people as to when, the House bills are
And they should-
presented and when we can have everybody go on and really push to get these things passed.
Great, and they
Because
can
that's
see
really
you
important.
afterwards for that.
Yeah,
because,
yeah.
Because of course, I pushed it a little bit, so I think we're about 5 minutes late, and some people have places to be. So we're going to close for right now. I'd like to thank you all very, very much for coming, and thank you to our panelists for your sharing, and appreciate it. Have a lovely evening. Drive safely.